Hello, everybody, and welcome back to The Radical Secular. I'm Christophe Difo.
And I'm Sean Prophet.
And we are back to talk to you about all kinds of different things, not the least of which is my shirt. But before we get into that, I want to hand it over to Sean Prophet to talk a little bit about the show notes.
Yeah, we have some exciting news and some announcements to make. Many of you may have noticed that we have a new logo and a new banner up for our page, and we're really excited about it. We have this brilliant designer named Tim Stettner, and we actually worked quite a bit with him on coming up with a sort of a philosophy, design philosophy for what we wanted. And what we were looking for is something very bold and simple that would kind of communicate what our channel is about and what we're trying to do here. And it obviously combines politics with because of the flag and the negation of sort of the nationalism and the religious, the theocratic aspects of what America has stood for, and that's really what we are about here at the Radical Secular is really kind of lowering the boom on this on theocracy and what it's done to the country and what it's actually the damage. We really are all about exploring the damage that this combining of religion and government has caused to America. It's vast.
Absolutely. And I think the sort of second piece of that is, and this is an ongoing quest in some ways, is that right? Because that is finding how do we, right? Because religion and government have lived together and been bad bedfellows for a long, long time. Most of human civilization, right? So. And a lot of the reasons for that is that it provides structure, it provides the sort of social glue, and it also provides a way for powerful people to keep less powerful people under control. And so the question then becomes, how do we as a society, as a civilization, sort of get away from the theocratic sort of glue, right? So that we don't need churches, church communities to keep us together. We don't need dogma to keep us together as a civilization. How do we replace that, right? And how do we replace that in a way that is secular? And I think secular is an interesting question. I think that is frequently miscommunicated, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Maybe you want to get into that.
Yeah, very, very much misconstrued subject. But I think part of our strategy also is to discuss the kind of damage we're seeing, that conservatism and hierarchy and all those things do to civilization. And that brings me to my next announcement, which is that we have a new feature that we're going to be trying to keep up with if time permits, and that is creating a shortened version of our show called Short Takes. And so we've already completed one of those. We'll be posting it very soon from our first episode, and they're going to be several weeks behind. But I think they're going to make a very good, a very attractive introduction to our channel for people who don't really want to commit to sitting down listening for an hour, don't really have the time. They can get kind of the gist of what we're talking about. And the first one is called From Conservatism to Fascism, and that is we really talked about this a lot in the first episode. How conservatism just lends itself and is now tending in the United States really towards fascism, even mainstream conservatism, and how that hierarchy approach affects and degrades democracy.
Absolutely, I think that's a really good point, and I like to hammer on this a lot, and we talk about that in that episode. But that is, it's really easy to think that fascism is a bunch of goose-stepping Nazis and spit-shine boots and skinheads, right? And that's what white supremacy is, or that's what that's what fascism is. But those things are those things, obviously. But what we're talking about here but those are just extreme versions of the same ideas that underlie conservatism fundamentally. And I think that you cannot separate those things and be intellectually honest with yourself, right? Like the sort of mainstream conservatism is just it's just that right-wing craziness light. That's all it is, right? And it's just a slower, more drawn out process, but it's the same outcome. It's the exact same outcome.
It's kind of the way they get you, the iron fist and the velvet glove sort of, it's a way of slipping this stuff in and saying, oh, it's not that bad. You know, we just want to protect private property and free speech and all these things, you know. And so they're using that. And meanwhile, they are just dragging the country.
Dragging it.
You know,
exactly. And Trumpism and Trump is it's just the most blatant and obvious sort of example. But like, right, but again, he's only exploited what the groundwork that the GOP has laid down since the civil rights movement, right? Like he's just exploiting he's just saying out loud what people have been dog whistling for fucking 30 years. So, you know, exactly.
You know, the Reagan policy under Reagan was not that different from what Trump is doing. Trump is just
exactly
phase of the same thing, but it's like there's a straight line between, you know,
exactly
Barry Goldwater to Reagan to Trump. You know, it's just that it's that simple.
You know, this is actually a really good jumping off point for talking, because you remember, you know, how Reagan liked to talk about the evil empire, right? Yeah. Like and the act, you know, and this is I think a really great sort of jumping off point for your T-shirt, actually.
Oh yes, well. I got to talk about this. My T-shirt says, "Never tell me the odds," and that is for everybody who is a Star Wars fan, the Millennium Falcon. And this is what we need. This is really what we need right now is a miracle of a rebel attack that hits the exhaust port and goes right to the core of the Death Star. Because we've got right now we're in such an advanced phase of the fascist takeover that we've got all of the ways in which we could democratically reverse this are under attack. You know, from the mail, the U.S. mail, postal service is now being attacked. You know, and that's on top of the gerrymandering. That's on top of the voter suppression, the voter ID laws, disenfranchisement of minorities all over the country, and Democratic voters. You know, this is like this. We are. It's almost. I don't want to say. I don't want to say hopeless, but it's very, very close to hopeless when you start to realize that it's almost impossible now to hold a fair election in the United States. And that's why everybody's all worried about it. I mean, whether we can even hold it and whether the results are going to be honored. So that's something that, you know, it's a scary time, and we need that miracle.
Absolutely. It really is terrifying. And of course, you know, look, I mean, if we can make the Kessel Run in under how many parsecs? If we could do that, Sean, if we could do that, we might be able to pull America back from the brink.
Parsec is a measure of distance. The film used it as a measure of time, and this is like nerd rage on
and like, you know, it's one of those things that you look back on and you know, it is so obviously wrong, you know, but you know, of course, it's just so classic. It is.
Let's make the Kessel Run in 12 parsecs.
Exactly. So my shirt this is the most provocative T-shirt that I own for obvious reasons. That is in fact a noose. This says bling bling, and on the back, I think it's on this side. It doesn't mean it. Anyway, it says Afropunk, and so Afropunk is an organization, you've probably heard of it. They're really big in Brooklyn now. They used to be small and out of Newark, and I was involved on one of their early projects way back before I even started law school. It was something that I was doing while I was in college, and you know, and I got one of these T-shirts from it. The reason why I'm wearing it today, though, and I don't usually wear it because it's so provocative, and sometimes I don't want to just walk around being the object of attention all the time.
Only you could get away with this. Only you could get away with that.
Yeah, only I can get away with that. Yeah. No. I don't recommend that. But you know, so you know, and so today, because it's you know, a solemn sort of remembrance of John Lewis, right? And I was reflecting on that today as I reread the article that he wrote, the op-ed that he wrote, basically eulogizing himself, right? And I was reading that, and then earlier today, I was drinking some coffee this morning and perusing Instagram, as I like to say, a hotbed of terrible ideas. And and there was a guy talking on one of these threads, and he had a meme that compared Black Lives Matter, or not just compared, but made the statement that Black Lives Matter and the KKK are the same, right? They're equivalent. That's the word I'm looking for, equivalent. And that is obviously laughably false. But I got into a little bit back and forth with him, and and it just reminded me of how, like, right, like this guy said, and this is the same guy who said, by the way, he's like, I only post things that are consistent with science. And it's just like,
oh yeah.
I mean, it's just like, and I mean, science, so, it just made me think of just, how far we have gone, right? Like that we are in a position where have a guy who is an influencer, right? He had like, thousands and thousands of followers on Instagram, right? And he's like Mr. MAGA. And he's out there like going ahead saying this stuff, and people are just like, yeah. And it just, and it's just this deliberate misinformation, right? This deliberate disinformation campaign that you get out of the right. And I had to literally say to him, and this is why I actually wore this today. It was like, well, like, have you ever heard of Black Lives Matter lynching somebody? I had never heard of once, And by the way, half the people out there marching with Black Lives Matter signs are white. When was the last time you saw a black guy at a Klan rally? Right. Yeah. So I'm just like, so I was just like, like that what really drives me crazy about that, Sean, is this idea of like this sort of minimizing the significance of the KKK and the significance of lynchings. And in that way, the significance of everything that John Lewis fought for. Right. Everything. Well, and that's why I wore this shirt today.
Where is the middle ground between lynching someone and not lynching someone? Where's the middle ground? Like,
yeah, exactly. Like what?
So, I mean, it's like, and this is what's going on. I mean, for those who are not familiar with the term, the Overton window is basically the realm of acceptable political discourse. And essentially, all the stuff that's being discussed right now on the right, it would have been unthinkable. I mean, you would have had congressmen, senators, news personalities just resigning, just being fired for saying half the stuff they're saying today. And the reason that's been allowed to happen is because the Overton window has been slammed to the right. So now you've got things that are in mainstream discourse that would have been far, far to the right, unthinkable things, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And so,
absolutely.
This idea that, of false equivalency, you talked about this in the show, our first show when we were talking about fascism, the idea the left wing and the right wing are on the same bird, all of this both sidesism and false equivalency is terrible. It's just, it is the loophole that demagogues drive the truck of fascism through.
Yeah, I like that one, by the way. That was a good one. That was a good. I like that. That was a good line, and because that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Because it's all about distorting the truth, right? It is all about misinformation, right? Because I heard a distinction today about misinformation and disinformation, right? So misinformation, I think, is right, like it's accidental essentially, but it's flying around. Disinformation is a campaign, right? Like that is like we are purposely trying to create a narrative, which is normal. We're like, right, that's what politicians, that's what everybody does. You have a narrative and you're trying to push a narrative. But the question is how close is that narrative, or is that narrative is deliberately designed to misinform, to disinform, to manipulate people into thinking things that aren't true? And this is what the Trump administration does, right? Like this is what they've done since the very beginning, right? They lie and they double down on lies and they triple down on lies and they quadruple down on lies, right?
Well, we're in a situation now where, for most of world history, there's been armed conflict to settle, differences. And, there hasn't been peaceful transfer of power. That's a new thing,
Sure.
And so in a situation where everybody agrees they're going to have a democracy, a Republican form of government, whatever, you have to agree that there's going to be, compromise and peaceful transfer of power. Well, in that situation, how do you engage in combat? Well, the war of ideas. These are munitions. These disinformation campaigns are munitions. They're cluster bombs. They're they're hypersonic weapons. They're nuclear weapons. And they're employed deliberately by people. And they it's like you said. The bottomless pit of bad faith. These are people who they're pretending that they're using their free speech to engage in honest debate. This idea that's a rational scientific position to say that Black Lives Matter and KKK are equivalent. It's like what if you can pretend that you're in the middle, right? If you can pretend anything extreme is possible. It's
exactly
window shifting again.
Yeah, that's a really important point, right? It's this idea of pretending that there is that it's just like, oh no, reasonable people can disagree, right? And like, right, and like this idea that like there's two reasonable positions. I think you had a post about this week actually, right? Like on Facebook, it's like, you know, we have to get past this lie that there is in America right now, that we are a divided country and that there's just two reasonable positions that just can't agree. That is not the case. There is one fascist position, and then there's everyone else. And by the way, within everyone else, there's a whole range of ideas, right? There's the full-on leftists over there, right? That are like, you know, let's fucking let's get out the pitchforks, right? You got those people over there. And then you have someone like Joe Biden, right? Who's a centrist guy. Overall, I mean, I'm not, you know, I don't. His position
again, centrist is a relative term, right? I mean, to us,
absolutely.
You know, but he's being accused of being, you know, of being, you know, a communist by right. They're so far to the right that everything, you know, reasonable looks like it's far left, and that's the consequences of the Overton window being moved. You know,
and that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right.
So I think you know, part of what we wanted to talk about today was, you know, was really like, what is secularism?
For sure.
And I think it's going to become a more of a regular feature as we develop, you know, just discussing some of these crazy things that are now, you know, part of the mainstream discourse, and a lot of those are being you know, promoted by religious leaders. You know, like you've got this one guy, you know, for example, this guy Robert Jeffress, who's saying that, you know, Biden voters have sold their soul to the devil. I mean, this is this guy right here. And, you know, how do you come off as a tax exempt religious organization? You're not allowed to comment on politics, right? And so, you know, it's one step away from saying that God endorses Trump, which some other evangelicals have also said. You know,
like
so
explicitly, right? Yeah,
they've turned this election into a battle of good and evil between God and the devil. You know, and that is incredibly corrosive to our politics.
Absolutely. And like, right, because then, you know, what ends up happening is you demonize the other person. And like, you know, and I, you know, both of us grew up in a hyper religious environment, like conservative and religious environment. So like we have experience with this firsthand. Right. And I remember growing up and my entire perspective was always very binary, right? Like, right. There was things out there called like the fallen ones was what it was called, but there were demons and incarnates and like sort of, but like basically just anyone who is evil. And by the way, you throw communism in there, right? Feminists, all of it, all that stuff just goes over. And so it's like this very sort of nebulous idea out there of just those evil people who do evil things, right? And like, and it becomes really easy to have this us versus them mentality. And it's like, and you can't frankly negotiate with that. Like we can't negotiate with that. And that's what I you know, I say, another one of my favorite catchphrases is we are in a knife fight in a fucking phone booth, right? We are not in a civilized debate where if we just give them some like a reason of like if we reason with them that we can get to a good result. And I think secularism is really important in this fact, right? Because we're not unlike them. We're not saying you don't get to do what you want to do. We're not saying you're evil people. We're saying that you can do whatever the hell you want. Just keep it out of our politics, right? Keep it out of our civil society.
Well, and this is what, you know, if you contrast our growing up years to what's happening now, in our church, I was always taught that church and state were supposed to be separate. So we limited our action to, we would engage in political action, but we limited it to prayer. And we would put out these you know, these prayer trees and these lists of situations and conditions that we would pray repeatedly about. But we were not out there electioneering, because that was clearly against the law, clearly against the tax exempt status of the church would be violated. These guys are just violating their tax exempt status left and right.
Absolutely. And that's so important. And like, I mean, I think it's important too. And I wonder what you think about this, Sean. I'm just thinking about this now. right? So I think a part of what was going on in our church is that it was like a fringish group, not fringe, just fringe group. And so, they were under attack all the time, right? Like there was always people like trying to, undermine what was going on there. But
a lot of bad press, a lot of bad press.
So like, so getting out there and suddenly becoming political would probably just give their opposition the ammunition they needed to attack them. But when it comes to Christianity, Christianity is about as mainstream as it gets. Like this guy right here, I'm looking at him right now. He's like, right, this guy is right, and he is prominently featured, right? Prominently featured. No politician would go out against him, right? Even politicians on the left aren't going to criticize this, right? Because it's toxic to criticize Christianity, and that gets to the problem, right? That gets I think to the problem.
Well, religion gets a free pass no matter what.
Right.
I mean, it's like people figure if that's somebody's religious belief, you can't argue with it. And that's
right. It deserves respect.
And by the way, our church was very much rejected because we had a sort of split personality. We had, on the one hand, some of our politics were very right-wing, John Birch kind of anti-communist, hardcore right-wing politics. But on the other hand, we had a lot of hippies and we had a lot of liberal ideas. Certain things about women's rights, certain things that that the church was very in disagreement with evangelicals, and evangelicals just thought we were a cult. So there was no talking with them. We were definitely not on the same page as evangelicals.
No. Like those things can't be confused, right? And like and again, like the vaunted status of religion, right? So like with the tax exempt status, right? The like basically it's you can't become president of the United States if you don't claim you're a Christian, right? Like you might as well say you are a pedophile if you say that you are an atheist, right? Like, you're like, that is how some people will think of you. And again, I'm not here I don't think we are trying to push atheism on people. I think that's an important distinction, right? Secularism and atheism are not the same thing. And I think that is a really critical distinction.
Oh, well, when I first came out of the church, I was very, very much into atheism and very much, called myself an atheist. I still do. But, the bottom line is that, there's not a goddamn person in the world who really knows whether there is a God or not, or who's met God or who's talked to God or any of that stuff. It's all bullshit. It is all bullshit.
Exactly.
Anybody who says they know one way or the other is completely out of their mind, And so it comes down to this idea of, positive versus negative proof. You can't prove there's a God. You can't prove there's no God. And it ends up becoming this kind of a pissing contest. I mean, epistemologically, it doesn't make any sense to believe that there's a God unless you have some sort of proof. But then they're gonna flip that around and say, oh, well, you don't know that there isn't one. And I know in my heart that there is. So it's an unresolvable argument. And it's really not even that important. Because what God ends up being is essentially a bully, sitting on your shoulder. That is essentially people use to get their will, to make their arguments for them, to say this is what God wants. But it's not what nobody has that phone to talk to God. Nobody. It's just not there. So
it's just not real.
Yeah.
And so, and this gets into the interesting question of natural law that we talked about earlier, like in our pre-show conversation. Because right, there's only a handful of people who claim to know what God means, right, and what God wants. Obviously, the Catholic Church is the churches, the pastors, all that kind of stuff, right? But it's all based on this idea of natural law. You probably talk about this actually better than I can. But this idea that law and order and everything is sort of ordained by and through an almighty creator. And I think you should talk about this in terms of, because I think you had a really great way of talking about this before the show.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you claim natural law or natural rights, like a lot of people talk about natural rights, that some of our
yes,
freedom of speech, assembly, press, all those things are natural rights, but they're really not, because there's plenty of societies throughout history in the world that have not observed those things. You could be,
in fact, most of them.
You could be arrested for speaking against the king. You could be arrested for rabble rousing and all these other things. There were a lot of so it took a lot of evolution to get us to the point where we made a declaration of rights, and then we agreed with each other we are going to enforce these rights in a court of law. So, but what are those rights and how is that decided? Again, nobody got on their God phone and, was told the right, so these are not natural rights. And because if you say that they are, you've just moved the problem around, right? You've still got people talking to each other in a room trying to figure out what is a right and what is not a right. And whether they say this is what I think or this is what God thinks, same thing.
Exactly. It's the argument from authority, right? And that's and that's what's so fundamentally flawed about it, I think, in many ways. The United States has had the beauty of the American experiment, which that term gets thrown around too much these days, but nevertheless, maybe because it's so precarious right now. But the sort of the idea and the beauty of the American experiment was that, like, look, we are not going to we're not deriving our rights from our society from the divine right of kings. We're not getting it from a religious a religious context. What we're doing is we're saying that we're agreeing, like you said, we're agreeing that these rights are inalienable. These are rights but we're agreeing, right? They didn't come from anywhere.
Yeah, we had to agree. The funny thing is they say endowed by our creator, but that's, again, it's just a figure of speech. It's just a
figure of speech. And I think that's really important because this gets thrown around all the time, and God we trust, blah, blah, blah. But like, you got to put it in the context of when they were writing this document, right? You're writing this time in a document where if you didn't say that, it simply wouldn't have been ratified, right? Like, I mean, right, you have to think about it in that context, in that way, saying like, I say, God bless you, when someone sneezes, right? Because I say these things, I say, oh my God, but
they're figures of speech.
They're figures of speech, right? And especially these guys were rhetoricians, right? These guys were like, they wrote in big, flowery terms. I remember you read these cases like Marbury versus Madison's like the first case you read in law school, right? And this was like basically sort of established the independence of the Supreme Court as the interpreter of the law, like the interpreter of the law, right? And so, but like, you want to read, I mean, I just basically summarized the case for you, right? Like those words basically summarize the case, but like those are like pages and pages of the most flowery language of just like this unbelievably. And so that is how people wrote back then. God was all in those documents, right? But it doesn't mean that these guys were Enlightenment guys, right? Like these guys that was where their influence came from. And so, we have, as a country, slid backward in so many ways. I mean, certainly we've moved forward in many, many ways. But in recent decades, we have gone back to this lie that like there is like some sort of like God-ordained country that we live in. And these pastors are literally saying things like, this is a Christian country.
Yeah, Christian nation. And how can you have freedom of religion when it only is one?
Right,
one God, right? You've got this God, Yahweh, okay, and it's supposedly the same God that is worshipped by Muslims with Allah, same God, Yahweh, Jews, Christians,
sure.
And it's like, but what about if you're Hindu? You got Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. You've
exactly.
got what if you're Buddhist? What if you're anything else like that? And so that kind of brings me to the point where if somebody says this is a Christian nation, that's when I turn back to them and say all gods matter.
Yes. I love it because that's exactly right. I mean,
how can you have religious freedom if all gods don't matter? It's like
exactly. It's so true. Right. So wait, are you, so like, right. And it's like, look, I mean, right. I mean, they all make competing claims. Like every religion makes competing claims about like competing epistemological claims, like about the nature of how to understand reality. Right. Like and metaphysical claims. So if they all can't be right. And so really, so that means that they're having a debate, right? And again, that's fine, they can have that debate, but let's not pretend that any one of them has a God phone, right? They don't.
Right.
They don't. And so the question becomes, how do we create a culture, a society, right, that's based on something that we can all agree on, which, by the way, like for example, like inalienable rights.
Well, and it has inalienable rights are things really that we've derived by tradition, from the Magna Carta going down through British common law, through U.S. law, case law, all these things like that.
Sure.
That obviously
Federalist Papers.
Federalist Papers. But Can you imagine like Alexander Hamilton's conducting a seance to write to Federalist Papers? He's like, this doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't. And so, you have people like this. This is another article I printed out today. And this is a guy who, named Pastor Rob McCoy from Thousand Oaks. And,
California, right? The guy in California?
Yeah. And he says that, he's all upset because, he's being prevented by COVID restrictions from, holding church. So here this guy is, and, he's taking his rights from his claim to God, right? To bring people together into a room to endanger their lives.
I mean, come on.
What are we even doing? What are we even look at himself in the mirror in the morning? How can he get up in the morning and look at himself in the mirror, and live with himself?
Yeah, I mean, it's unreal. It really is. And, it's this sort of authority-based. We talked a little bit about this before the show too. Like it's this idea. We talk about this a lot in general on the radical secular, and that is about hierarchy, right? It's about this idea that, like my God-given rights, right? That's what you hear all the time. Like my God-given rights. It's mostly only with respect to the Second Amendment for some reason. All the other amendments don't seem to matter, but whatever. Second Amendment, God-given rights.
And freedom of religion. He wants to assemble. These are basic rights, but he's doing it, in a time that's dangerous, where there's a good reason, a government reason to protect people from not doing that, because every right.
Absolutely. I wonder, I wonder, because the government, when the government is restricting rights, right? Like there is, and it depends on the kind of right. There's a strict scrutiny analysis, right, that the court takes. So that means like for race-based claims, there's just for example, there's a strict scrutiny approach. So that means the government has to have a compelling justification, right, based on safety, based on X, Y, and Z, right? So whatever reason, for the rule. And then there's sort of the intermediate scrutiny, and that restrictions that may restrict women's rights get intermediate scrutiny, which is fucking bullshit, but that's how it works. And then there's sort of things that are not connected specifically to identity. And again, I always make my preface that I'm not a constitutional lawyer, right? I'm just sort of telling them from my general experience. But I wonder how the COVID-19 restrictions, when they are, because I know they're being bouncing around in the courts a little bit, right? And I wonder how the court will eventually approach these restrictions, right? Because, for example, the freedom of assembly, right, is a fundamental right, and the government can't restrain those things. Without a really, 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 really good reason. But what about what about wearing a mask, and what about public safety, right?
I have an analogy, and that is we have freedom of movement. We have movement between states, movement within our city, and everything else like that. But cities put curfews in place when there's a natural disaster. They restrict your freedom of movement. If there's a rock slide that washes out a 4-lane highway, okay, the government can close the highway and say, you may not drive on this road. It is now a crime to pass the roadblock because public safety. And I don't see how this is any different.
I think that's right. It's funny because conservatives, like to have it both ways. I think on one side, they're very law and order, right? The rules. If he just complied, he wouldn't be dead, right?
California pastor
exactly.
urges him to ignore, and this is a conservative. This is a conservative,
right? So it's just like, wait, so which one is it, right? So you get to pick and choose which rights that you get to assert, and or which rules you just get to flout because of your natural rights, right? But meanwhile, like this black guy doesn't have the right to literally be alive, right? At the end of a fucking traffic stop. Come on,
double standards. Bottomless pit of bad faith.
Bottomless pit of bad faith.
Yeah.
Bottomless pit of. Go ahead.
This is where fascism really comes into play, and it is full of double standards. It is full of personal loyalties and fiefdoms,
absolutely,
as opposed to impartial rules. And these really are, this is what we're up against when we say we want secular government. We want no double standards.
Exactly.
You are held to account if you engage in bad faith arguments or bad faith applications of the law.
Absolutely.
Judges will shut you down. Judges will not listen to you. And that's the problem with the Trump judges. You get these guys in there and women who he's appointing, and you're going to get these kinds of rulings. You're going to get somebody who's going to bias their ruling, in favor of religion in spite of public safety.
Absolutely, and that's fascinating. And I keep coming back to this, but it's this idea that if I am at X place in the hierarchy, and I only have to answer to the people above me in the hierarchy, right? So like I don't have to answer down. So basically, like what I say going down, and no one can question that, right? So that's what and that's what I'm seeing over and over again with the sort of, and that's what's so insidious about religion and politics getting together, right? Because religion's all about that hierarchy, right? God is at the top of the hierarchy, and ministers and priests and pastors, et cetera, are here interpreting that, and no one gets to question that, right? And no one gets to question that, and that is, I think, what's so dangerous. So, and that comes to the accountability piece, which is also that no, you don't get to hold anybody above you accountable, right? You only get to hold people below you accountable. And by the way, that accountability doesn't come from from a set of rules that we've all agreed on. That just comes from my authority.
Right. Well, and this is what you'll hear a lot of times, in these conversations you have with religious people, whether it's on Facebook or whatever. And it's baffling to me, how these people don't believe in democracy. Their whole attitude is God does not ask permission, God commands, right?
Exactly.
And this is that's very Old Testament, but even Jesus had some pretty harsh commands in the New Testament, and that is what, once somebody has decided this is what God wants, this is what Jesus said, this is what God said, no human government is going to be respected at that point, and they will stake their lives on it.
Absolutely. And look, ironically, these are the same folks that hate all the entire Islamic world, right? And think that the Islam is coming to destroy them, whatever. But that also, by the way, harks back to this whole idea of this like evil them out there and us behind this protective wall of religion or tradition or whatever else, and the inside community versus the outside hordes, right? Mm-hmm. But they hate. I look. I'm no fan of Islamic states, right? Like, I mean, from what Turkey is devolving into, but the most obvious examples are Saudi Arabia and Iran, right? And those are like the most obvious examples. Saudi Arabia being the most god awful of those examples. But but the bottom line is, it's like these people hate those, like these conservatives, these religious conservatives, and like they hate these countries and these organizations. But like that's exactly what you want to achieve here, though, right? Like you want religion, like the government to be subordinate to religion, and that is what we at the Radical Secular are railing against. Railing
because here's what it is. They just think they're going to be in charge. They can't imagine a scenario where this could be turned against them.
Right? That's so true. So true.
Like there was this whole conspiracy theory about Muslims trying to set up Sharia courts in the United States.
Yes.
And these courts, I mean, I guess they do exist, but they're basically to resolve community matters within expat communities from these.
Right.
You have Muslims and there's a dispute between families or whatever, and that's what the court is for. It does not supersede U.S. law. But the Christians are so paranoid about it that they're worried that these guys are actually trying to set up an alternate court system. And they're engaging in such projection because that's what they would like to do. They would like to have you, instead of going before a judge or a magistrate or whatever, they would like to have you go in front of a religious figure to have your problems adjudicated. So it's almost like it's very it's preposterous, because none of these people would want to live in a Muslim theocracy. I mean, this is a place where you could be stoned to death for saying you want to leave the religion. There's no
exactly. And like, you definitely don't want that. I mean, and again, the fundamental, the underpinning of all of this is always ignorance, right? And cherry picked facts and not fully understanding what a theocracy is, right? Because if they really understood what a theocracy is, they'd realize that's exactly what they're advocating for, like, right? Because they clearly don't know it. So a lot of it, again, if you are taking your information like without any question from the pastor just because he happens to be the pastor. And meanwhile, this pastor is also actively engaged. We're watching it right here. We just talked about it, right? Actively engaged in electioneering and politicking, right? I mean, come on. So basically, like, so you're in this position where you don't ask any questions, and you just and anything that contradicts the views that you have already established is just the evil people trying to propagandize you, right? They're trying to make you stray from God. Like these, again, I like to stress this, and I keep saying this over and over again, but we talk about these extreme examples, and I don't want people to say like, oh, well, I'm not that kind of Christian. And I'm sure you're not if you're a Christian watching this. I'm sure you're not that kind of Christian, right? And I'm sure you're not a religious zealot. But then the question becomes though, at a bare minimum, like let me use the example of white supremacy, right? White supremacists, we think of white supremacists, you think of like skinheads, right? You think of goose-stepping Nazis and spit-shine boots. Right, that's what you think when people like to think, or KKK and nooses, right? Like that is right. Racism, but that's what white supremacy is. But like that's not that's a caricature of it, right? Yes, those people exist and they're terrible, but that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is how religion and conservatism sort of work together in this sort of insidious partnership, and also racism, right? And it's insidious partnership that is quiet. It doesn't yell at you, right? Trump is the first time, and Pence are the first time that they're literally using a bullhorn. Before that, they were using dog whistles, right? But now we're just seeing, this Trumpism and what the Republican Party has devolved into, and what it has traditionally been, is the framework within which, is the groundwork upon which those white supremacists, all those evil people sort of exist.
Absolutely. And I mean, by the way, the word theocracy should strike fear and terror into everyone. Like
it does me.
When I say theocracy, okay, people kind of, their eyes glaze over. They're not really locking into what this means. This is Kim Jong-un level, Stalin level stuff, okay?
Absolutely.
The Handmaid's Tale is not an exaggeration. It is not an exaggeration. And a lot of people think
terrifying.
Even a lot of liberals are kind of like, oh, well, that would never happen,
Exactly.
And it is happening. It's happening now. The framework for The Handmaid's Tale is being laid right fucking now.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. And it's this idea that, right, people think that fascism shows up where you just wake up one day, one day you're voting and the next day Nazis are dragging you out of your house. Like, that's not how it happens, right? Like, it doesn't happen like 0 to 100 one day. It's like it happens drip by drip by drip, right? Like, because the whole frog in the water analogy, I think that's actually not true. Like, I've heard that that's actually complete bullshit. Like, the frog will definitely jump out, but the analogy is that, if you put a frog in the water, you slowly turn up the heat over time, the frog will literally cook itself. And that is not true for the frog, but it certainly is for us in civil society. This happened not in Chile, but in recently in now I can't think of the South American country. But you had I listened to a radio show about this recently, a podcast about this recently. It's like the people, it didn't become like a fascist authoritarian government overnight. Like, it was one little thing at a time, just enough that people don't want to react, right? They want to just go about their daily lives. Like, we have a bias towards that, right? Human beings, we all have a bias towards that, and then one day you wake up and you realize that you can't leave your house, or you can't vote, or the vote, or the election has been postponed, right?
Right. Well, and this is what it is that, a lot of Americans are very afraid. And if they tell themselves that this is not as bad as it seems, that allows them to have a little bit more time, a little bit less fear, a little bit less direct anxiety. But, it is something that, the alarm bells are ringing.
For sure.
the klaxon is going off. We are at that point right now where, it's conceivable that, in some number of years from now, we might not even be able to do a show like this.
Right, right. Which is fucking nuts, right? I mean, like, certainly if people like Donald Trump had their druthers, we would do it, like, right? Like, anything that was critical of him would be wiped out of the media, right?
He's already called the press the enemy of the state. I mean, the enemy
right, over and over again. That's part of his rhetoric.
Yeah.
Part of his, like, his campaign stump speech, right? Like, he's like, right, like that's not even like once or twice. The first time he said it, we all like flipped out, right? Because we're like, wait a second, this is like literally Nazi propaganda, right? Like, this is like right, this is like, right, there's actual stuff that says this in the Soviet Union or whatever else, right? So, but now it's now commonplace, and that's the kind of normalization that we're talking about.
Nobody pays attention anymore.
No one even pays attention to it.
That's Trump popping off on his Twitter feed, but
exactly
what they don't understand is that this is corroding our discourse, on a daily basis. And this is I want to talk about also, like, for example, because we started to touch on John Lewis and his President Obama's speech at the funeral. And the fact of the matter is that it was one of the most it was a brilliant speech, and it was really probably the speech that John Lewis would have given had he been able to give his own eulogy. So
absolutely.
It was a impassioned speech. It was very current and talking about a lot of the things that are going on that the Trump administration is doing, and it was bold. It was timely, and I can't think of it was also statesman-like. I mean, it was
absolutely.
It was the kind of message that we need to hear as a nation from the White House, and. Yep. What are we hearing now instead? There's been a whole bunch of right-wing commentators popping off about that speech, talking about how, it was politicized. And, it's like, politicized? This is what John Lewis's entire life was about. John Lewis, basically paved the way for Barack Obama.
Absolutely, he did. And Barack Obama did his early on, he did his standing on the shoulders of giants a rhetoric, and not in this speech, but in general. Like, he did that when he was president. And these are the giants he's talking about, right? Like, these are the giants he's talking about. And so for Tucker Carlson to go on the air, like, in that just complete piece of garbage that he is, and then accuse Obama of politicizing a speech. And of course, if you read, and I have it right here, if you read John Lewis's thing, I mean, like, right, like, Obama basically, it reflected John Lewis's op-ed. Like, I mean, it really, really did. I mean, it capitalized on those themes. It talked about those themes, right? And so for Tucker Carlson to come out here and say that that Obama's politicizing John Lewis's death, which is this gaslighting, because it's precisely what Tucker Carlson is doing, right? Like, that's exactly what he's doing.
It's completely flipped around. It's completely flipped around. I mean, Obama's speech was tone, pitch perfect. For what should have been said at that time. And the fact of the matter is that Tucker Carlson and the entire right wing are actually deathly scared that Black Lives Matter is making a huge difference. That the tide is turning. The tide is finally turning to the point where there's not going to be able to be second-class citizens in the United States anymore.
Right.
The hierarchy is going to go away. And so this is a catalyst. What's happening right now with Black Lives Matter is a catalyst, and it is a groundswell. I mean, if the people get to vote in November, they will sweep out this administration, and they will sweep both houses of Congress. If we hold a fair vote, okay, that's going to happen. And so that means that at a certain point, fascism is not going to be able to operate as openly as it has during the Trump administration. And these guys have tasted blood. They have tasted blood, and they are now out for blood.
Absolutely. You made an analogy. Maybe on one of our previous shows, or maybe one of our other conversations, when you said that, right? They, especially during the Trump administration, right? So they are like an animal, like a trapped animal, right? Like, they're in the corner, and they're in that corner. And I'll just keep piling on analogies. But, like, right, they've also painted themselves in that corner. Right. So because they had a choice when Trump ran, actually, let me back up. They had a chance in 2008 when Obama won. They had a choice. they could say, okay, look, this is the face of a new America. Obviously, right? Like the old regime is starting to change. What we could do is we could adapt. And they tried to for a while. There were some people in the Republican Party that said, look, we need to start thinking about our future. Like we can't run purely on racism anymore. This tiger, we've been riding this tiger a long time. We have to find out, we have to like pull in conservative Latinos, right? We can do some things to make our art, to rebrand ourselves. But they didn't because of Mitch McConnell. They doubled down. They doubled the fuck down. And they did them for 8 years. For 8 years, they did the exact opposite. And the right-wing media, and because they just couldn't forego the immediate like reward for down the road significance. And then they had another chance after Obama. Oh, because here comes Trump, right? And they had another chance, a more poignant chance, to say, hey, you know what? Maybe we should, condemn this guy. Maybe we shouldn't get on board, but they did. And now they've painted themselves in this corner and they are a scared animal. And I actually, in a lot of ways, enjoy watching it because fuck you, honestly. Fuck you, Tucker Carlson.
I have a few thoughts about this, and the
Go for
first one is just talking about how in the 2016 campaign, all of the mainstream Republicans who probably would have done a lot of what you just described, like Jeb Bush, or I don't know about Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio is pretty out there, but Jeb
Bush, fucking shithead, that guy.
Would have mainstreamed the Republican Party a little bit more, more like Mitt Romney or someone like that.
Exactly.
Could have gone that direction. And what happened is that Trump knocked them all out. And that doesn't say as much about the Republican Party as it does about the American people, because Republican voters, primary voters, it's like the party didn't choose him, primary voters.
Right.
So this rhetoric appealed to those people much more than the mainstream sort of rhetoric that the Republicans, the other candidates were using to try to, to not go in that racist direction. And this ties back into the demographic transition that we're going through. And that is that, by, I think it's the mid 2040s, we're supposed to be a majority minority nation. California already is a majority minority nation, and also under 25s, I think, are already majority minority. But we will have by the 2040s a demographic shift whereby the entire population, including seniors, are majority minority.
Right.
So, and that's happening through die-off and through the birth rates. It's just natural.
Just happening.
It's like what I said before. If you wanted to go back from a multicultural society into a white ethno state, you have to deport or kill everybody else, and that's not going to happen. So I suppose it could, and this is where this is going.
That's what's so terrifying about it. Yes,
they can't do this any other way.
Right.
The demographics are going to swamp them. So they had a choice to either live by democracy or to fully embrace minority rule, which is the moving 5%, 10%. Well, what happens when it's 20%? What happens when they got to win by 20 in order to stay in power? And the only way to do that is really to just some kind of martial law or just full on repression. You can't.
That's it.
You can't voter suppress your way out of a 20% deficit.
Exactly. You basically just, at that point, you have to just suppress voting altogether, right? And you have to literally have an apartheid state, like a South Africa, or or in the most extreme example, an Israel, right, with the Palestinians, right? So you basically have like a group of people that you just. I've talked with conservatives about this before, because conservatives are frequently, obviously are anti social programs, et cetera, and so and I always say this, like, so if your argument is like, let everybody just, sort of pull themselves up by the bootstraps, like, you have to know, if you're honest with yourself, that a lot of people are going to fall through the cracks. Like most people are, right? Most people right? They need food. People need food stamps, right? They need unemployment insurance. They need all kinds of things, right? They need healthcare. So my question to conservatives though is like, so what is your plan for all of these dying and dead people? Like, right? They're like, right? As just like, are you going to wall them off and just put them in a tenement somewhere? Because that's what you'll have to do. And that is what happens in Palestine. That's what the Palestinians are going through, right? That's what That's what apartheid was. That's what in the 60s, the tenement buildings, right? They threw black people and redlined them, right? That is what happens when you don't address the needs of communities. That's what happens. And we see that is not long-term tenable. It never is, Sean, because people, and this is what conservatives never understand, and fascists never understand, and authoritarians never understand, is that people have an initiative. People don't want to be lower on the hierarchy. People want to be free. People want to be free. You cannot stamp that out. You know, like you might think that you have your pet black friend who's okay with not being black and not talking about blackness, but he or she's not really happy, right? You know, and it's just a matter of time if she gets with other people that she's going to say, like, you know, fuck you, why am I doing this, right? Like, and then that's how revolt comes. So my question to conservatives is like, what are you going to do with all the dead people?
No, they have no plan, and they haven't thought it through. And you know, if they will make moves toward fascism, and that's where you could see a new modern Holocaust. And
right.
I want to take this back though
Sure.
to the original point of this show, and that is, you know, what is secularism? And in order to answer that question, we have to really go back to where, you know, gods began, and you know, you take society where it started out in small tribes and clans, and you know, there were a lot of you know, nature gods and things like that, ancestor worship and all, and those types of things. But when you started making the transition from hunter-gatherer to agriculture, you started having larger cities. And it turns out that anthropologically, these larger cities and kingdoms, once they got to about 1 million people, you started to see angry gods and powerful gods and vengeful gods coming into play. And that's where, you know, all of the Judeo-Christian tradition came out of the Middle East, which is kind of the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia and those places. So it really is, gods were brought into government early on to deal with, you know, larger populations. And so that's why we still have a problem with this, because they had to control those populations. They were not democracies. They were kingdoms.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so the ruler had to have the authority of a deity. They had to, and in Egypt, you know, the sun god Aton, you know, with Akhenaten. Okay, I mean, this just goes on and on. You look at all of the ancient world, and this is true. The marriage of hierarchy of God and king and country, you know, what has just a long-standing human tradition, and that's what we have to break.
Absolutely, and I think that's a really important point. And I think is critical to point out is that, you know, we're fighting against an unbelievable momentum, right? We are digging our heels up against a ball that has been rolling for literally all of civilization, right? And that is a really hard thing, right? So we're at a point where, you know, and I'll use the term atheist, and I'm really an agnostic, right? Because I really, as a technical matter, I can't say whether God or not exists, and I believe that proof matters. So, but like, as a shorthand, atheist, right? You know, people we were saying earlier, like, right, you can't be president of the United States unless you at least claim to be a Christian, right? I mean, obviously, you know, what's his face in power right now is not a Christian. Obviously, he just sociopath.
Couldn't care less. He couldn't give a fuck about Christianity or religion.
Possibly care less. I mean, he couldn't possibly care less about anything that does not have directly to do with him.
Yeah.
At all. So,
but he's a theocrat's dream. He's a theocrat's dream. He's doing everything they want because they've made a bargain.
Yes, exactly. Right, exactly. They've made a bargain, and he knows that bargain, right? He panders right to evangelicals all the time. He knows where his power comes from, because that's exactly where it comes from, and that's why he picked Pence, right? Pence is like the sweetheart of the theocratic right. He is like the face of the theocratic right. The guy who calls his wife mother, like, just what the fuck, man? Like,
that is the weirdest. That is some of the
weirdest fucking thing. You know, what is that? Like, you know, like what? Anyway, it's like just so old school. I mean, like he's a guy who, like, you know, like Handmaid's Tale is like his wet dream. Like, you know, like you like.
I mean,
Whenever when I was watching that show, I told my wife all the time, I was like, this is what Mike Pence wants. You think I'm being dramatic, but this is the world he wants.
No
this is it. Fucking crazy, dude. Fascist, authoritarian, and theocratic. Lost my train of thought. I don't remember where we're going with that. We can talk about something else. But that was
we're getting close to the end of our time. We're at about an hour. So
okay.
If you want to, I think it's been a good conversation. I'm really happy about it. And
yeah, I think it was a lot of fun. I think too, like I really hope that we clarified a little bit for everybody what secularism is and sort of why we call ourselves a radical secular, right? Like we are committed. We see ourselves as a bulwark against theocracy, right? Like we are pushing back against, we want to, like our goal is to galvanize people, like-minded people, and perhaps not even people who aren't even like-minded, right? And get now, but maybe will be, and get people involved and realize that, look, nobody wants a theocracy. Nobody, like even religious people out there, you really don't want a theocracy, right? And because like any reasonable person doesn't want a theocracy. And so we, at the Radical Secular, we are radically committed to secularism as the glue that can hold a society together and that can move us forward into the 21st century and frankly, get us to a point where we are consistent with countries like Norway, Sweden, and most of the EU that is like increasingly more secular.
Yeah, and one thing I want to say about that, I mean, I do believe that secularism, it is the nexus where that kind of cuts through all the, left-right, political nonsense, that goes on here. Because, if you can just answer the question, does this make the country more secular or more officially religious in terms of government? And that's what we need to do. We need to move away from official religion.
Exactly.
I want to clarify also that I have no problem with churches. I have no problem with religious freedom, with mosques, with temples,
not at all,
with Buddhist temples. All of those things should be part of civilization. They just should not get tax preferences, and they should not be able to write laws. And that's really kind of sums up the whole secularist position.
So true. And and I'll let you to talk us off, but but bad religion, and as everybody knows at this point, if you've been watching this for any length of time, is my favorite band, and and all about rationality and secularism. And the idea is, one of the songs is "Do What You Want." But the first line is "Do what you want, but don't do it around me." And so it's like basically like, and that is what I say. I have no problem with religion. I have no problem with church. I have no problem with any of that. It's like, just don't do it in my government, right? Like, because we all have to be part of this government, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not just you, it's all of us. And I don't believe that. So let's just do something neutral, essentially neutral, that is based on things that we can agree on, which are things like, everybody, like people should be happy. People shouldn't be starving, right? Like the basic principles of civilization.
Yeah, utilitarianism, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness.
Exactly.
It's very much like sexuality.
What a great analogy.
Basically, have sex with whoever you want, do whatever you want, threesomes, foursomes, I don't care.
Whatever.
As long as it's consenting adults and as long as it's in private. I don't want
exactly.
And
I don't want to see you guys have sex. I really don't. I don't
want to see it. I don't want to see you worship. I don't want to see you have sex. That's like,
right, exactly. I think it's great that you do that. Do what makes you happy.
Good. All right, everybody. Well, thanks for watching The Radical Secular, and we will see you next week.